The scoreboard still read 4-2 when the sun went down. The inning never finished. No one cared. A game between Barracks 9A and 12B had ended not in victory, but in a slow, wordless stillness as someone from the watchtower called down the news. Germany had surrendered. Captain Rusk didn't call another announcement. No bugles, no flags, just a single radio placed outside the mess hall where a dozen Germans gathered to listen. The voice came through clear, in English first, then in translated German. Unconditional surrender, all hostilities to cease. Some prisoners stood in silence. Others sat in the dirt. A few wept not from sadness or joy, but from the exhaustion of hearing that the world they'd been told to die for was simply over. By nightfall, the entire camp was back in their bunks, but no one slept. Lucas lay staring at the rafters. No home to return to, no war to fight, no orders, no empire. But in the morning, men still lined up for breakfast, still buttoned their shirts, still combed their hair. And by mid-afternoon, the field was raked again. Baseball filled the vacuum that surrender left behind. It started without meaning to. One American private walked out to stretch and toss a few pitches. Then another joined him. Then 3 more. Then someone handed a glove to a German who had nothing else to do. Soon every barracks had a team again. But something had changed. The games felt different. They weren't Germans versus Americans anymore. They weren't even Germans versus Germans. They were just games. Mixed teams formed. Americans played alongside Germans. Guards coached prisoners. Prisoners taught guards German nicknames. The scoreboard didn't track nations anymore, only innings. By May 19th, someone had scrawled in paint across the dugout wall. Camp ASHFRD League. No ranks, no FLAGS, no losers. But the world outside still moved on. Newspapers arrived, photos of bombed cities. Berlin reduced to smoke and skeletons. Men read about Dachau and Buchenwald and refused to believe it, then refused not to. The German officers in Camp Ashford were quietest of all. Their war was not just lost, it was poisoned. Kruger, once defiant, barely left his bunk now. Gerber took to walking the perimeter twice daily, eyes far away, as if searching for someone he couldn't name. And yet they kept showing up to games, not to play, not even to speak, just to watch. Because the game, for reasons none of them could fully explain, made it possible to exist. One afternoon, a fight broke out. It wasn't violent, not really, just shouts and shoves. A bad slide into second base, a close call, a boot kicking up too much dust. An American shouted, "Safe." A German shouted, "He was out." Another German shoved him. Someone threw a glove. And for 10 breathless seconds, fists clenched. But then Lucas walked onto the field. Quiet, calm, he picked up the ball, walked it back to second, and placed it on the base. "Start again," he said. "The dust makes fools of us all." Nobody laughed, nobody cheered. But the game resumed. And after that, the teams kept a second score, not just runs but warnings, for arguing, for cheap shots, for forgetting why they were playing. June came. The sun baked the fields. The wind carried the dry scent of dust and cedar. And then the trucks started arriving. Repatriation. German POWs were going home slowly by region, by unit. Names were called over loudspeakers. Orders were read. Men were told to gather their things. One morning, Corporal Rutsch was gone. 2 days later, the catcher from Barracks 10 vanished before breakfast. By the end of the week, a dozen men from the 9A team were missing. Not escaped, not punished, just gone. Lucas packed slowly. His name had been called, transport arranged, destination Bremen. He had no idea what waited there, or who. He hadn't heard from his mother in 2 years. His brother had died in Tunisia. His father, a party official, was likely dead or in prison. He sat on the edge of the bunk, glove beside him, and stared at the diamond outside. It was empty, midday sun, no chalk lines, just the worn tracks of thousands of footsteps in the dust. A figure stepped into view, Sergeant Cole, American, red-faced, always chewing gum. "You gonna take it?" Cole asked, nodding at the glove. Lucas looked down at it. "I don't think they play baseball in Bremen." Cole shrugged. "They might now." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, tossed it underhand. Lucas caught it, unwrapped it. A baseball, scuffed, signed in marker by half the Ashford teams. He stared at the names, Americans, Germans, nicknames. "Thank you," he said. Cole nodded. "Next time someone tells me the war was all hate, I'm gonna think of you catching that line drive in your damn oversized boots." They shook hands, no salute, just hands. And Lucas climbed into the truck. Camp Ashford remained open another 4 months, but it was never the same. Too many gone, too many ghosts. The field was still there. New prisoners arrived, mostly late war stragglers. They watched games now with confusion, not recognition. But for those who'd been there, who'd played during the quiet months between surrender and return, it was something else entirely. A memory no bullet could erase. Not a prison. Not a battle. Not propaganda. Just a game. Played by men who'd once tried to kill each other. And who, for one bright, impossible spring, remembered how to be human again. The field at Camp Ashford grew quiet as summer deepened, not because the game had stopped, but because the players had. One by one, they left, by truck, by train, by silence. The crack of a bat still rang out in the evenings, but fewer feet ran the bases. Fewer gloves thudded with the sound of caught pop flies. Fewer arguments over balls and strikes echoed across the dusty yard. By June's end, of the 34 prisoners who had played in the first full German team, only 6 remained. And none of them knew when they'd leave. The war was over, but no one told them when home would begin. Lucas now worked in the carpenter's shed, building benches and repairing crates with a quiet focus that no longer came from fear or discipline, but habit. His hands needed purpose. The field had once given that. Now the field was a memory that lived in the dirt and scuffed base paths. He sanded planks during the day, read borrowed American books at night. Hemingway, Steinbeck. His English had improved through the games. The soldiers' slang had seeped into him. Once he would have rejected it, now it was simply language, survival. One morning, Sergeant Cole brought in 2 new arrivals, late captives, not from Tunisia or Italy, but from the last month of the war, pulled from a collapsing position near the Rhine. Both wore remnants of Wehrmacht gear, neither spoke. Lucas offered them gloves. One refused outright, the other looked at it like it might explode. He understood, the war wasn't done inside them yet. But still that night, one of them came to the fence and watched. The game had changed. It wasn't baseball anymore, not as the Americans knew it. The rules were bent, the innings ran long, and players switched teams mid-game if someone left for kitchen duty. But it worked, because now the games weren't for winning. They were for filling the space between meals, between letters that never arrived, between the camp loudspeaker calls that slowly thinned out names, fewer every week. One guard, Private Emerson, barely 19, always covered in sawdust, joined in regularly now. He pitched underhand with a goofy wind-up that made everyone laugh. No one remembered who first called him Strudel instead of Emerson, but it stuck. He embraced it, even signed Strudel on the wall beside the dugout in charcoal. That wall now bore more than 50 names, half German, half American, all scrawled in the same dust-dark strokes. In July, the camp received a visit. An Army photographer arrived from Fort Sam Houston, sent to document daily life at Camp Ashford. He walked the perimeter, snapped photos of the bunks, the mess hall, the watchtowers. Then he noticed the field. He took photos of Lucas throwing warm-up pitches, of Germans sliding into bases, of Americans shouting encouragement from the dugout. He asked for names. No one gave ranks, only nicknames. Fritz Strudel, Wheels Doc Lucky Dusty. The photographer scratched his head. You sure you guys are prisoners? The men laughed. We were, someone said. The photographer chuckled and lowered his camera. Well, you're the happiest damn prisoners I've ever seen. Lucas didn't reply, but later when he sat alone under the backstop, he thought about it. Was he happy? Not exactly. But he wasn't afraid anymore. That counted for something. In late July, something new arrived: paint. Cans of it green, brown, white. No one explained why, but rumors swirled. Camp Ashford would be decommissioned soon, repainted, repurposed, maybe even handed to civilian authorities. It wasn't official, but it felt true. That night, Lucas and two others snuck out to the field with a brush. They painted something onto the far outfield wall, large, messy, uneven. It wasn't German. It wasn't English. It was baseball code. 643 equals peace. Every American understood it immediately. Shortstop to second to first, a double play, a perfect sequence, a small, quiet miracle. And a message. Because they weren't soldiers anymore. They were just men looking for order in the dust. By August, letters began arriving more frequently. The Red Cross resumed processing mail. Some men received postcards from mothers. Others learned their towns had vanished. Some read obituaries for wives they hadn't known had died. One man in Barracks 8 went silent for days after his letter. Then he showed up at the field with a bat, said nothing, and played for 9 straight innings. No one stopped him. August 14th came with stifling heat. Radios across the camp were tuned to the same static-wrapped broadcast. Japan had surrendered. The war, all of it, was over. There were no cheers, no parades, just men sitting on bunks staring at their hands. Some wept, some laughed, most just sat. Lucas sat in the dugout, alone. The field was empty that day. He thought about the game against the 9A team, the double he'd hit, the way Gerber had clapped him on the shoulder afterward, the American umpire shouting, "He's safe by a country mile." He remembered the dust, the sun, the laughter. He remembered not thinking about war for 3 whole innings. It had been enough. March 24th, 1945. Noon. The Texas sky shimmered like hot steel. A long freight train clattered down a single dusty rail track into the American interior, escorted by armed guards on each side. The windows were barred, the doors reinforced, and inside, packed shoulder to shoulder, sat 362 German prisoners of war. Most of them were from the Afrika Korps, captured in Tunisia, shipped to Norfolk, processed, shaved, tagged, and now transported to what none of them could imagine, the middle of nowhere. Oberjefreiter Lucas Eberhardt, 22, leaned his forehead against the window bars and stared at the passing desert. He didn't speak. He hadn't since Naples. The war had been brutal, but captivity was something else. The uniforms were gone, the medals stripped, the swastikas erased. All they had left was their silence. And then the train slowed. Someone muttered, "Is this a work camp?" Another said, "No fences, it's not even guarded." But they were wrong. There were fences. They were just buried behind wind-blown prairie and camouflage netting. Watchtowers were painted brown to blend with tree trunks. Guard posts disguised as sheds. And somewhere ahead, behind that veil of American subtlety, was Camp Ashford. Camp Ashford had rules. And the rules would break everything these men expected. Lucas heard the first sound as the train screeched to a halt. A strange, hollow clunk, clunk, clunk. At first he thought it was gunfire, some final humiliation. But then the doors slid open, sunlight blazed into the car, and what they saw made no sense at all. There beyond the gate American soldiers stood laughing, and beside them in the middle of a field was a diamond, chalk lines, bases, a bat, and two men in U.S. Army fatigues playing catch. Baseball. The noise they'd heard was a ball striking a glove. Lucas narrowed his eyes. For a moment he couldn't speak. He'd imagined prison camps like the ones they'd built in France. Barbed wire, dogs, men shouting in foreign languages. What he saw now was surreal. A military band played faintly from a speaker somewhere beyond the field. Not Wagner, not marches, something light, almost cheerful. Glenn Miller, maybe. Then came the order. Out of the cars, line up. They complied, stiff-backed, sunburned, eyes hollow. Lucas stood among them as the American officer approached, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the prisoners' faces. "Welcome to Camp Ashford," he said. "You'll be assigned quarters, given soap, uniforms, and work details." He paused, then added, "You'll be expected to behave like men." That final word wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. Lucas didn't move, but deep in his chest something shifted. It wasn't relief, it was confusion. Because nothing about this camp made sense. They were the enemy, and yet across the field another American waved his glove and shouted, "Hey, Frank, throw it low this time, my knees are wrecked." Someone laughed. The Germans had landed in a place stranger than any battlefield. A prison camp with music, baseball, and no guards in sight. And that was only the beginning. The barracks were simple but clean, wooden bunks, mattresses, soap, towels. Lucas stared at the polished floorboards like they were some kind of trap. At mealtime they were handed plates of meatloaf, boiled potatoes, even pie. No one believed it. That night in Barracks 12B, Sergeant Heinrich Gerber broke the silence. "They're fattening us up for something," he said. "They don't feed prisoners this well unless they need something." Another man said, "Americans love to pretend they're better than us." But Lucas wasn't sure. He'd seen American air raids flatten entire cities. He'd seen flame and phosphorus and silence where neighborhoods used to be. But here, in the middle of Texas, they were playing music at dinner. And there was that field, the baseball diamond, perfectly raked. Every morning it was the same. Reveille, roll call. Then the Americans played, not just catch, full games, in full uniform, with chalked lines and umpires and jeering and jokes. By the end of the first week, Lucas couldn't help himself. He stood by the fence and watched. Not the guards, not the buildings, the game. It made no sense. The bats looked heavy. The rules were foreign, but something about the rhythm, pitch, swing, run, catch began to feel familiar, not in detail, but in spirit. It reminded him of home, of watching football matches in Leipzig, of competition, of normal life. 2 weeks in, something even stranger happened. An American soldier, an older man, maybe 30, with a scar under his left eye, walked over during a water break and tossed a baseball through the fence. Lucas caught it out of instinct. The man just smiled. "You throw." Lucas hesitated, then nodded. The American grinned. "We need an extra arm, you're in." No permission, no orders, just like that. Lucas blinked. "We're prisoners." The man shrugged. "Yeah, well, not today." The next day 3 Germans played catch behind the mess hall. 2 days later 7. A week later they had a full team, or close enough. No one officially said it was allowed, but no one stopped them. On April 2, 1945, under a sky so blue it looked painted, a team of German POWs walked onto the diamond. The Americans laughed, not cruelly, almost in disbelief. The prisoners wore hand-me-down fatigues, oversized gloves, and boots 2 sizes too big. But they stood straight. Someone in the American dugout called out, "This ain't Geneva, fellas. Y'all know the rules." Gerber shouted back, "We play, we learn, we beat you." The Americans roared with laughter. The game was chaos. Lucas struck out 3 times. One of the German players tried to run the wrong direction around the bases. Another tripped over third and landed face first in the dirt. But in the 6th inning, something happened. Lucas caught a line drive in center field. Clean, smooth. The whole camp erupted in cheers, Germans and Americans both. And suddenly, it wasn't war. It wasn't a prison. It was just a game. That night, Lucas lay awake and stared at the rafters. The war was still happening. Men were still dying in France, in Germany, in the Pacific. But inside the fences of Camp Ashford, the world had changed. No one had fired a shot. No one had given a speech. But somehow, everything felt different now. He didn't know it then. None of them did. But Camp Ashford would become the first American POW camp to host an organized baseball league made entirely of German prisoners. There would be uniforms, team names, even scoreboards. But on that first day, none of that mattered. Because on that field, they weren't enemies. They weren't soldiers. They were just men. And for the first time in years, they were playing again. The smell of cut grass lingered long after the game. Not that it was real grass. Most of the diamond was hard-packed dirt and Texas weeds. But after years of diesel smoke and blood in Tunisia, even weeds had a sweetness to them. Lucas Eberhardt walked back to the barracks with dust on his boots and sunburn on his neck, carrying a glove that didn't fit. Behind him, half the camp buzzed with half-spoken disbelief. They played baseball. No guards had stopped them. No officers had scolded them. There had been no inspection, no consequences. In fact, the Americans had cheered when a German caught a pop fly, laughed when the pitcher hit the backstop. They had all laughed. Corporal Gunther Roch muttered, "This is propaganda. They're softening us." No one answered. Because somewhere deep inside they all knew the truth. There was no trick, no plot, no psychological game. The Americans were just like this. And that was the strangest thing of all. By the 3rd week, the camp's daily rhythm had changed. Reveille, roll call, work detail, baseball. It wasn't official. No schedule was posted. No announcements were made. But every afternoon the same thing happened. 2 or 3 dozen POWs drifted toward the field. Some sat on benches. Others leaned against fences. A few tossed balls or took swings with scavenged bats. Some still refused to go near the game, not because they feared it, but because they didn't understand it, or didn't want to. Back in Barracks 6C, Staff Sergeant Rainer Kruger made that clear. "They're trying to make us forget what we are," he said one night. "We're soldiers, not schoolboys." Another man spat into a tin cup. "We're prisoners, Rainer. We can't even decide when to eat." "We're still Germans," Kruger snapped, "and Germans don't play their games." But it was already too late. Because even in Barracks 6C, when the sun went down, someone would ask, "What was the score?" On April 9, 1945, something changed again. Captain William D. Rusk, the camp commander, stood at the head of the mess hall with a sheet of paper in his hand and a smirk on his face. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've got our first formal request." He held up the letter. "Team Ashford Rangers of the United States Army challenges the prisoners of Block C to a 3-game series." Gasps rippled through the room. Some of the guards laughed, but the Germans didn't. Because by now they had a team. They had a roster. And strange as it was, they had pride. The preparations began that night. American supply clerks lost half a dozen jerseys. A new set of gloves appeared. The Germans fashioned cleats by nailing scrap metal into the soles of their boots. Someone carved a scoreboard out of old plywood. And Lucas found himself in the middle of it all, appointed as unofficial captain. He didn't ask for it, he didn't even speak English well, but he was steady. He could hit, he could catch. He never shouted, never panicked, never talked about the Reich. Most importantly, he listened. By game day, word had spread across the entire camp system. Trucks rolled in from Camp Mexia, Camp Brady, even one from Louisiana. American GIs leaned over fences. MPs stood by with clipboards. German prisoners climbed onto rooftops. There were hundreds of eyes on that dusty diamond. And when the Germans stepped onto the field, baggy uniforms, mismatched gloves, boots tied with string, the crowd went quiet. Then someone shouted, "Let's see what the Krauts got." And the first pitch was thrown. The Americans led early. Their pitcher, an ex-minor leaguer from Detroit, threw fastballs that curved like they were bending around gravity. The German batters flailed. But by the fourth inning, they started to adjust. Heinrich Gerber cracked a single through the left gap. Lucas followed with a triple. Another man bunted and sprinted like his life depended on it. The score was tied 3-3 in the seventh. And that's when the storm came. Thunder rolled from the north. The wind kicked up dust so thick you couldn't see the bases. Rain exploded across the field in sheets. The game was called off. No boos, no shouts, just laughter. Everyone ran for cover. Americans, Germans, guards, cooks. And as they ran, Lucas saw it happen. A prisoner and a guard, slipping in the same puddle, laughing as they helped each other up. It didn't matter who won, not that day. Because something larger had already happened. After that, baseball wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Germans played Americans, Germans played each other. Barracks formed teams, wagers were placed, bats were shared. Fights broke out over rule violations. One man, a mechanic from Dresden, took to carving tiny wooden trophies. And yet behind all of it, the war raged on. Every week new prisoners arrived. Exhausted, shell-shocked men from the Western Front. Some had seen entire battalions wiped out. Others had watched towns burn. They came in hollow, suspicious, bitter. Until they heard the crack of bat meeting ball. And then they watched. And then they played. Even the SS men, even the officers. On May 8, 1945, Captain Rusk called a meeting of all camp leaders, American and German. He kept it short. "The war's over," he said. "Germany surrendered this morning." The room went still. No one cheered, no one moved. Lucas felt something shift behind his ribs, not relief, not shame, just emptiness. Outside, the camp was quiet. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. But by that afternoon, the field was active again. Because there was nothing else to do. And because the sound of a baseball hitting leather still meant something. It meant the day would pass. That men could be something other than enemies. That the world hadn't entirely fallen apart. Not here, not on this field. Not where the war had ended in silence, and baseball had spoken instead. The morning after Japan's surrender, no one showed up to rake the diamond. Not because they forgot, not because they were busy. Because they didn't know if it still mattered. Lucas walked out just after dawn, alone. He carried his glove tucked under his arm and stared at the field that had once felt like the center of gravity for the entire camp. There were still footprints in the base paths, chalk smudges in the dust. The scoreboard still showed 2-1 from a game that had ended in the 8th inning and never resumed. But now, the war was officially over. The camp was silent. Peace had arrived, and no one knew what to do with it. He stood there for a long time, watching nothing. Then he knelt, found the rake propped against the dugout wall, and began to drag it in slow, deliberate strokes across the base path. By the time the sun was fully up, the field was ready. And by noon, they were playing again. Only this time, the teams were unrecognizable. Barracks divisions were gone. American and German lines had blurred beyond recognition. Private Emerson played shortstop next to Carl Fisher, a former flak gunner. An American corporal who once guarded the watchtower now pitched underhand to a man who had served at Tobruk. A rumor spread that one of the batters had once stood guard at a POW transport in Belgium, while the man catching for him had been in the cargo. No one confirmed it, and no one cared. They ran, they hit, they laughed. Not every man in the camp joined, but many did, more than ever before. The same week, repatriation orders resumed. It was slower now, no urgency, just bureaucracy. The war was over. There was no longer a logistical rush to redeploy. Names still echoed from the loudspeaker. But now, when they were called, they didn't spark panic or hope. Just quiet nods. Acceptance. One of the last officers from Barracks 4A, Lieutenant Dieter Valls, received his papers and stood at the edge of the diamond for nearly an hour, watching the game. He had never played, never wanted to. But before he left, he asked for a ball. Lucas gave him one. Valls turned it over in his hand for a long time, then walked away without a word. That night during lights out, someone started drawing. Not carving, not etching, just pencil on paper. A small sketch of the diamond, a few players, a crude scoreboard. By breakfast, it had been passed around half the camp. Within days, dozens more appeared, some childish, others detailed, full team portraits, favorite plays, diagrams of positions. None were signed, none were claimed. But they were collected, folded carefully into pockets, tucked into journals, slipped into letters. Some would survive the journey home. Others would vanish into trunks and basements, and war stories never told. But for those who drew them, they were proof that it happened. August turned to September. The days grew shorter, the Texas air cooler. One afternoon, Captain Rusk called Lucas into the administrative office. "I've got a question," Rusk said, sitting behind a desk piled with papers. Lucas nodded. "What do you think about playing outside the camp?" He blinked. "What?" Rusk leaned forward. "There's a civilian league in town. Some of the local boys want to host a game, just for fun. They know the war's over. They know you're not guards, not soldiers anymore. They just want to see if you can hit." Lucas didn't answer for a long time. When he did, it wasn't a yes or no. "I'd need to ask the others." "You've got 2 days." The meeting in the barracks that night was tense. Some thought it was a trap, others said it was a test. But most said what Lucas was thinking already. Why not? They had played Americans before. They had played themselves. Why not play a town? Why not see what it meant to be seen, not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as ball players? And so, on September 8th, under the yellow glare of borrowed floodlights, a team of German prisoners walked onto a dusty Texas field in front of a crowd of more than 600 locals. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't speak English well. But they played. And when Lucas drove a line drive past third base to win the game 6-5 in the 9th inning, the crowd stood. Not in protest. Not in confusion. In applause. When they returned to Camp Ashford, nothing had changed. Same bunks, same chow, same roll calls. But the men carried something different now. A strange and quiet pride. Not in winning, in being allowed to try. In having something to show the world besides surrender. The floodlights from the Texas field still echoed in Lucas's eyes as the truck rumbled back toward Camp Ashford. The ride was quiet. No one talked about the score. No one recounted the plays. No one needed to. What they'd just done, walked onto an American field, under American lights, cheered by American families, had shaken something loose in every man in that truck. Not violently, just enough to make them look at their own hands and not see rifles or surrender anymore. Just fingers, calluses, leather, dust. A few of the men smiled to themselves, not big smiles, just something close to peace. When they passed through the outer gates, the guards didn't stop them, didn't salute, just waved. And no one said a word when Lucas stepped off the truck, still holding the same ball he'd hit into right field in the ninth. Over the following week, everything slowed. Meals got quieter, work assignments relaxed, the loudspeaker barely buzzed. Some prisoners began spending more time inside, writing letters, cleaning boots, reading. They'd stopped asking about going home. Because the camp didn't feel like prison anymore. It felt like purgatory. Not punishment, not freedom. Just waiting. Then the letters started again. Not official ones, personal. One from a boy in town, written in shaky penmanship and broken German, thanking Lucas for the game. Another from a woman who said her husband had fought in France and never returned, but who'd sat in the stands and clapped anyway because peace has to start somewhere. Even a note from the opposing team's pitcher, scrawled on the back of a newspaper. Hell of a hit, hope your folks are okay back home, no hard feelings, Chuck. They were passed from hand to hand, translated, reread, memorized. Some were folded into wallets, others tucked into sleeves like good luck charms. For men who hadn't been called by their first names in years, it felt like something sacred. One morning, a chalk line appeared again on the field. No one admitted to drawing it, but by noon, there were 5 men throwing warm-ups. By dusk, 2 full teams were playing. It was as if the surrender, the letters, the game in town, all of it had reset something. Not in their uniforms, not in their records, but somewhere else. Somewhere deeper. Lucas sat outside the mess hall one night, watching the fireflies drift over the field. Cole came over and handed him a small wooden box. Inside was a stitched leather baseball, slightly yellowed. On the top, burned into the wood, were 4 numbers. 9845. Lucas looked up. "It's not from me," Cole said. "Someone in the town sent it. Said it was the most American thing they could give a German without starting a fist fight at the post office." Lucas turned the ball in his hands. He had no idea what to say. So he just nodded. By October, fewer than 60 prisoners remained at Camp Ashford. The rest had gone home, some with smiles, some with silence, some with nothing but folded baseball scorecards in their breast pockets. The camp's fences were still up, but the gates were left open during the day. Guards no longer carried rifles. The field, however, was immaculate. It had become something sacred, not declared, not spoken of, just understood. Even men who never played kept it clean. Because on that dirt, they remembered they weren't just what the war had made of them. They were something else. Something no newspaper could report. Lucas had stopped asking questions about his departure date. He knew it would come. He knew a train would arrive, and he'd be told to gather his things and return to a country that no longer had a capital, where no one remembered who was a soldier and who was. But for now, he still had a glove, and the same dusty base path to run every evening. October's wind brought with it the smell of burning leaves and distant wood smoke. In the early mornings, frost began to form on the field's battered bleachers. The games didn't stop, but the laughter softened, the motion slowed. Fewer men remained. Those who did stayed close. The barracks no longer felt like separate units. They were just buildings with thin walls, filled with men who had learned how to live quietly. For the first time since the trains brought them here, Camp Ashford felt like a town. not a village, not a prison. Something in between, a place you knew wouldn't last, but one you couldn't quite leave behind in your mind. Lucas found himself returning to the Diamond each evening, even when no games were played, just to walk the base paths. He traced the track from home to first, rounded second slowly, stepped across third. Once, he stopped halfway down the third baseline and looked out across the outfield. The grass had grown thin, the chalk lines had long faded. But he could still see it, the games, the crowds, the clumsy boots sliding into home. The place where men stopped shouting and started listening. He stayed there for a long time, then turned and walked back toward the barracks. A new officer arrived the next morning. He wore a clean uniform, stateside pressed, with eyes that scanned everything like he'd just stepped into command of the Western Front. Captain Rusk met him at the gate. They spoke quietly. The new man frowned, pointed, asked questions. By evening, a notice had been pinned outside the mess hall. All remaining POWs to be processed for transfer to Fort McCoy. Final transport begins November 3rd. It was typed, centered, signed. No explanation. Just a date. The men read it in silence. Then one tore it down and folded it into his pocket. That night, Lucas gathered the last dozen players in Barracks 12B. They sat on crates, bunk edges, their gloves tossed in a pile near the footlocker. "This is it," he said. No one asked what he meant. Everyone already knew. "Let's play one more." No votes were taken, no arguments raised. One man stood, then another, then all of them. October 31st, 1945. The final game at Camp Ashford began at 3:00 p.m. There were no uniforms, no scoreboard. Just 18 men in mismatched boots, jackets too thin for the wind, walking onto the field like they were stepping into a church. They didn't pick teams, they didn't need to. They knew who belonged where. Cole showed up midway through the second inning. He took up position in left field and said nothing. 3 other guards joined him by the 4th. By the 6th, an entire group of kitchen workers stood at the edge of the fence. The game wasn't fast, it wasn't clean. But it was beautiful. Every run was earned. Every out felt like the closing of a book. By the 8th inning, no one cared who was winning. They were just playing. Bottom of the 9th, tied 5-5, 2 outs. Lucas stood at the plate. The pitcher, a man he'd once hated for reasons he could no longer remember, nodded. The ball came in fast. Lucas swung. The sound cracked across the field, sharp and clean. He ran past first, past second, around third. He didn't look back. He slid into home, dust exploding in a soft halo around him. Everyone waited. The catcher pulled back his glove, opened it. The ball wasn't there. Safe. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just stood there for a long moment in the fading light. Then someone picked up the ball and placed it on the pitcher's mound. The game was over. And so was Camp Ashford. The final transport came 3 days later. It was gray, early morning. Fog drifted like slow ghosts between the empty guard towers. The flag above Camp Ashford barely stirred. The men were told to gather by the gate with only what they could carry. Most brought little. A pack, a coat, some letters. One man had a baseball tucked into his jacket. Another, a glove dangling from his belt like a trophy. Lucas stood near the back of the line. His boots rested on the frost-hardened ground, his eyes fixed on the field behind him. He could still see it. Every base, every line. Even without the chalk, without the crowd, it was clear. The place where something had changed. Something inside them. Cole stepped forward, clipboard in hand. He wore the same uniform, but there was something different in his posture, no stiffness, no squint. just a man watching another leave. "Lucas." He looked up. "You good?" Cole asked. Lucas nodded once. He wasn't sure if he was good, but he was ready. The men boarded the trucks, no handcuffs, no shouting. Just the creak of boots on metal and the heavy rumble of engines starting. A few turned to look back, most didn't. The field had already begun to fade behind them, swallowed by fog and memory. 40 miles down the road, Lucas finally unfolded the small envelope that had been pressed into his hand just before departure. Inside was a photograph. Blurry, faded, but unmistakable. It showed the team. The Camp Ashford 9. Some grinning, some solemn, all standing in front of the old dugout, boots muddy, gloves raised. Someone had written on the back in English, "It was never just a game." Lucas didn't go home right away. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven weeks later, he stood on the German shore with thousands of others and didn't move. The landscape before him wasn't the one he'd left. Whole cities were gone. Factories twisted into skeletons. Families scattered like ash. But he still had the photograph. And the glove. And the story. Years passed. War tribunals ended. Rebuilding began. The Cold War thickened in the air like smog. And in a small town outside Kassel, in the corner of a modest school gym, Lucas hung a framed photo above the chalkboard. Below it, he placed a worn leather glove on a shelf. Students asked who the men were. He told them. Not about war, not about surrender. About baseball. About how men who had once been enemies could still find their way back to something human. In 1983, an envelope arrived from Texas. Inside was a ticket stub. Yankees versus Rangers. And a note, written in the same blocky hand Lucas remembered from so long ago. "Figured you'd want to know. My grandson's pitching for the high school team now. Says he wants to throw like the Germans did in '45. Cole." Lucas laughed when he read it, then placed the ticket stub beside the glove. And for the first time in months, he went outside, walked to the edge of the woods, and started clearing space for a diamond. Decades later, after his death, the box was found in his attic. Inside, one stitched leather ball, yellowed with age. A scorecard from October 31, 1945. A photograph of a team that officially never existed. And a short note scrawled in German. "War made us soldiers, baseball made us men again."